Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Can Historic Buildings Be Environmentally Sustainable? Another webinar made possible by the fantastic players of the National Lottery. Thank you so much to Jason from Focus Consultants for running this for us. Focus Consultants are a long-standing corporate supporter of the Heritage Trust Network, so it's great to have Jason here. And thank you also to Sarah, our HTN Scotland Development Officer, who's here helping in the background, and she'll be answering any questions that might come through during the course of the webinar, and also adding your questions that you might post through the chat box onto our Padlet. Hopefully you've seen the link to that. So before I go any further and introduce you to Jason, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Heritage Trust Network, because we have quite a few people that are new to us on the webinar this morning. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background first. So the Heritage Trust Network is the UK's umbrella body for heritage professionals, groups, organisations that are enthusiastic about rescuing and restoring heritage buildings or sites. We've currently got over 300 members, and we're all about peer-to-peer networking and knowledge sharing, and basically trying to make it much easier for each group that comes along to rescue and restore that building that they've set their sights on. One of our huge member benefits is our toolkit, which is absolutely jam-packed with videos and case studies, how-to guides, and basically advice on how to run your project successfully. So really, it's a great thing to check out if you're thinking about becoming a member. We've also got a fantastic conference coming up in November. Throughout the year, we run local events when we're able. At the moment, they're all online. Training workshops, and we've got an upcoming online community for our members, which will make networking much easier and much more effective. I just wanted to point out our events page that's on our website, which is there at the top. We've got lots coming up. We're running the Open High Streets programme of events for the Architectural Heritage Fund at the moment, and we've got a few more of those coming up before Christmas. And as you can see there, lots more events plus our conference. And by looking at that picture there, it looks like the conference is on one day, which it is. It's on the 20th of November. But if you click on that link, it shows you that we've got a whole week of events running up to that that are all connected to the conference. So please do check that out after the webinar. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We always get asked if am I on mute? Is my webcam off? Because sometimes attendees don't know who can see what. But I can assure you, you're all muted, your webcams are off, so it doesn't matter if you sat there in your pajamas maybe, it's all okay. There will be a Q&A session at the end. The webinar is being recorded and it will be on the Heritage Trust Network website from next week. You will get an attendance certificate along with a feedback form, and that will be emailed to you about an hour after the webinar finishes. As I'm sure you know, as anyone that runs a project that's funded by an external body, we have to provide the feedback. So if you could please fill in that feedback form and let us know what you thought of the webinar, that would be fantastic. Again, post your questions on Padlet if you can. If not, just post them in the question box here on GoToWebinar, and you've got a QR code there just in case your smartphone can access the link in that way. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Jason Redfern from Focus Consultants, and I just need to make him presenter, so bear with me a second. That should have come over to you, Jason. You're on mute. There
Brilliant.
we go, I can hear you.
I was getting a little bit nervous there. Thank you very much for the introduction there, Beverly. Hopefully everyone can see the presentation screen. I want to thank the Heritage Trust Network for giving me an opportunity to present today. So Beverly posed quite a challenging question to me about whether can historic buildings be environmentally sustainable. So the running order for this presentation, I have an agenda set out here. So there'll be a bit of an introduction to Focus Consultants, some background and context to the issues that are faced by the heritage sector and these buildings. A look at the holistic building approach, because I think that's key to answering some of the questions that were asked as part of that. And then we'll look at those more detailed questions about how can we ensure that sustainable materials and methods of construction are adopted in historic buildings, how we can ensure that the buildings are as energy and water efficient as they can be, and then look at appropriate sustainable technologies, which will actually be looking at those through items 4 and 5, and then whether we can make the case for reuse on sustainability grounds of historic buildings. And in the end, as Beverly said, there'll be some opportunities for questions. So firstly, a bit of an introduction to Focus Consultants. Focus Consultants has been operating for over 26 years. As it says there, who are we? We're a multidisciplinary practice of construction, property regeneration and sustainability specialists, providing what we see as...
Sorry,
yeah.
just to jump in, we're still seeing your kind of PowerPoint page. It's not quite in presentation mode.
Right, okay. Is that page is what you want?
Hang on, I can just see your webcam now. Oh, there it is, much better. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, apologies. Hopefully this is a lot clearer for you all now. So very quickly, just to introduce Focus Consultants, as I was saying, we're a multidisciplinary practice working in construction, property regeneration and sustainability arena. We like to think that we try and bring clarity to our clients in what we see as an increasingly complex built environment. Our head office is Nottingham, but we have offices in London, Newark and Leicester. And how we can describe what we do as a company is split into really 3 divisions, which is the Create division, Deliver and the Assess. Create, being very active in this sector in supporting funding and investment and business planning, economic development, and then supporting research and evaluation of projects to look at how we can help deliver them. The Deliver is much more core services associated with project management, building surveying and quantity surveying, cost consultancy services. And then the Assess part of the company, for which I'm responsible for, covers how we create sustainable buildings across both existing and new, building physics, i.e. how do buildings react to some of the services and fabric change we do to them, compliance with building regulations, compliance with planning, and then we do performance testing of buildings. We like to see how buildings perform. Myself, my background is a chartered building surveyor, and I've been working with Focus for over 17 years, and within that 17 years I've been responsible for working within the sustainability sector for them and growing these services. Currently advising on a lot of low and zero carbon strategies for my client base, and I've worked on thousands of homes and buildings in my career in helping people meet some of the challenges associated with sustainability goals and climate change. Key aspect for what I do day to day is that I'm very interested in as-built performance. I'm very keen on ensuring that what we set out to do at the design stage makes it to reality and actually is achieved. And that's one of my key passions. The sectors that I work across are there. So broadly, we work across the UK and we work across all these different sectors. Okay, that's the introduction to myself and Focus. So a bit of background and context. This is really looking at some of the policies that are driving some of these questions, you know, and whether we can achieve some of the targets set by the government. So post-Brexit, the government set out a document called the Clean Growth Strategy, and it helped or looked at a pathway for the UK to achieve decarbonisation across all sectors, so manufacturing, housing, non-domestic. And within that, it set out that existing buildings would be part of that strategy. And it also set out that we would need to look at reducing our CO2 emissions in our domestic and non-domestic buildings, including new build, by a significant amount. What came out of that was, more recently, was the Future Home Standard, which was a requirement for new build homes to achieve around 80% reduction in their CO2 emissions. Although not specifically relevant to this sector, non-domestic buildings will be looked at in the same way, and how we treat and deal with our existing stock are also very important as well. But you can see some cues in there where in the trajectory of the government wanting to go. That is to incentivise electric heating, to look at high standards of fabric efficiency, and to think about whether we can use heat networks and other means to service our built environment. In May 2019, the government acknowledged the climate emergency, and from that, several local authorities and bodies as well declared climate emergencies and set targets. And Theresa May committed the UK in June 2019 to a net zero carbon target by 2050, of which, as I said, 74% of district, county and unitary authorities have now declared their own climate emergencies in line with the government target. So there's a little bit of local policy and context as to why climate change is, again, increasingly on the agenda. Other reasons why it's on the agenda and it's of importance is to do with population and resource demand. So population has grown in my time since I've been delivering these presentations from around 6.5 billion to 7.75 billion now, and it's projected to achieve 12 billion by 2040, 2050. That's going to place huge demand on resources across the globe, and governments are trying to tackle that by looking at policies that can maintain stability and allow growth, but address this challenge. It's important to understand what the government's definition of net zero carbon is as well. The government's definition basically says that they want to be neutral in terms of their global greenhouse gas emissions, which obviously includes CO2. But that can include offsetting, and that can be part of a strategy that we can discuss later on in the presentation, is that you can use offsetting as a means of trying to achieve some of your sustainable goals. The middle slide or middle sort of table is actually about some of the more detrimental facts of climate change, which is to do with sea level rise, deforestation, and really to summarise at the point that the International Panel on Climate Change is stating that we are reaching a point of no return, which is why we've seen things like the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Treaty before, which are about setting international goals to then make change at local levels for reducing CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions to help manage temperatures. So, there are risks of greater extremities in weather and migration and other issues purported by the International Panel on Climate Change unless we make changes. A useful statistic, as well as the emerging economies I mentioned there that are actually driving demand up, and might have slowed recently, but still China, obviously a growing economy. Currently we need 1.6 Earths to sustain our demand on resources. So we need another 6 of the planet to help us to continue on the consumption that we're doing now. If we don't make any changes, we're going to need 2.5 Earths to match our consumption pattern by 2030. So these are some of the reasons as to why we can see change. What's the role of historic buildings? So having looked at some of the documentation out there, I've taken a couple of quotes here from that. And here we've got one from the Heritage Counts, Heritage Environment, and just from this year, which sets out, and I've set out in bold here, how our approach to existing buildings is going to be integral to meeting carbon reduction targets. And I completely agree with that. I think existing buildings, historic buildings, have a place in trying to achieve these carbon reduction targets. And that's highlighted below by the Green Building Council's quote, which is basically saying that 80% of the stock that we've got built now will still be in use in 2050. So again, that's highlighting the role that existing buildings and these historic buildings have in helping us to reduce the UK's overall CO2 footprint. The answer isn't necessarily in new construction, which is kind of a question posed later on, because although I work within that arena where we can try and make a building as sustainable as possible and reduce its emissions down almost to negative, there will be a certain amount of time for that to pay back. And actually, what historic building is saying in this last comment is that because of that, you need to look at your existing buildings again and the existing stock and what you can do with that to again overall to meet this carbon reduction target. So some useful sort of context there in relation to historic buildings. Now, Beverly invited me to this presentation was a bit of a throwback because nearly 10 years ago, I did a piece of work with Focus called the Green Museums Project in 2011. And at that time, we engaged, as it says there, with 14 different museums in the Northeast. And we subjected 2 of these museums to quite a detailed building analysis, which moves on to the next section about a holistic approach in looking at hard to treat or historic buildings. It introduced me to this holistic approach, although it was embryonic at the time, and it made me realize that the context, use and specific building needs are really important in when you're making decisions about what to do with your building in relation to energy efficiency, any sustainable goals or resource changes. Because physical measures, like I'm stating there, weren't always possible. There will be listed status, there'll be planning consents, there'll be restrictions, and you have to look at what you can do with the building you have. We were disseminated the information at a presentation which I did, and we had 50 museums attend, and it was positively received. And you can see here some of the work we did in the table on the right hand side, where we looked at different measures, which are maybe some of the questions that the audience might have at the end of this presentation. What can I do, and what can I do to reduce CO2 emissions? How can I make my building sustainable? And we costed them. So this taught me a lot about how to look at these buildings, and it's refreshing to come back and visit this sort of 9 years on. What's changed since then is the supporting material is there now. I'm not saying it wasn't available at the time, but maybe it wasn't as in depth. So in preparing for this presentation, naturally I've researched, and obviously we're working with the Heritage Trust Network. We know that there is a lot of guides available, extremely good guides, and I do quote from these documents as I go through this presentation, and there are many available. But there is a wealth of information available to you to support you on a journey and where you want to try and improve energy efficiency or make your buildings more sustainable. So just touching on what I think is the important baseline to actually try and address some of the questions on how you can make historic buildings environmentally sustainable. A lot of these guides do refer to the fact that you need to look at a holistic approach. You need to look at your building as a whole, and you may want to stage this process because some of this will be a physical survey, and some of it will be actually looking at what you want to achieve. And I guess that's the first question I pose. What is it you want to achieve in relation to making your building sustainable? Is it a wider policy aspiration? Have you decided that you want to achieve net zero carbon by 2030, or you want to reduce your CO2 footprint? Is it that? Is it a carbon reduction target? Is it a percentage? Or is it actually about energy efficiency and running costs, which are obviously vitally important, and the two can go hand in hand? Is it sustainable transport measures? Is it actually encouraging people to travel to your venues and your buildings more sustainably, both staff and visitors? Is it just a reduced environmental impact overall? So looking at the waste generated in your operation, water consumption, consumables, are you just looking to look at how you can improve biodiversity in some of the landscaping that you have? Or is it purely just adaptation? You have some construction works planned or some maintenance works planned, and you want to understand what's best for your building. Understanding those objectives will help you to understand what information you need. And some of that information can be metered energy, it can be or water use, it can be looking at your waste generation and cycles, and looking at the operation of your business and what consumers you use. So you need to ask yourself, what do you want to achieve before undertaking this whole building analysis? As I said at the start of the presentation, I'm interested in as-built performance, and with that you need accuracy. So I guess from the whole building approach, which is advocating looking at your fabric, your services and your use, it's about understanding your baseline. Where are you right now in terms of your CO2 emissions, your CO2 footprint and your energy consumption? And I find that the more accurate that information is and the more informed you are on that, the greater chance you have of mitigating risk in making poor judgments on some measures to your building. So knowing your building, its construction and its condition is important. So you need to understand how the fabric is built. Do you have single glazed? Do you have a solid wall construction? Do you have a cavity wall construction? Do you have a roof which is thatched? Do you have what sort of condition is the building in? You need to understand whether it's it requires maintenance, or whether there are limitations in terms of its longevity and whether that warrants investment. You can actually do quite significant investigation work, which is set out in one of the Historic England documents. You do a thermographic survey, which looks at heat loss of the fabric. Or you could do a very simple walk round, either yourself or with a construction professional, and make some simple decisions about what can be done. But you need to know your building, you need to know how it's built, and you need to know what condition it's in to help provide the accuracy to make decisions going forward. Similarly, you need to look at your services in the same way. So your heating, your lighting, your ventilation, and your hot water. What condition are they in? What age are they? Are they efficient? What control mechanisms do you have in place? Do you feel they're fit for purpose? And as much as we could look at how you can minimize impacts from your fabric, so you can insulate your building, actually getting your services right and getting the controls right to match your use can actually give you greater benefit. You need to understand its function. So because operational energy is part of this, you could almost look at CO2 and energy. You have what's embodied in the building, which I'll discuss later on, and what you expend through its operation. So there could be simple changes or behavioural changes with staff and occupants, where you perhaps don't leave lights on or equipment isn't left on standby. And what we're really talking about here is like an energy audit. We undertake an energy audit on the building to establish anything that's wasteful in terms of behaviour patterns and how that can be addressed. And I think the point I make here is you might want to consider how you want to use your building in the future. So not only look at it now, but you have to have in mind what you want to achieve with your building, and whether there is any other further adaptations or any aspirations to do provide different services within your building when you undertake this. And it can involve questionnaires with staff. You have to be realistic about the budget, because everything I've gone through there has an element of cost, and cost is obviously key. But I think you can adapt this to suit your budget, and you can be realistic about what you can achieve in relation to from the survey findings, and you can phase works. But I think the point I'm trying to make is you need to understand where you stand, where you are as a baseline, to help inform you in terms of what your aspirations are further down the line, and then plan them and phase them. And that's the point I'm making here, is that from that you can form objectives, you can create a plan that's realistic, and importantly, you can try and meet aspirations, realistic aspirations. Understanding your building will allow you to make informed decisions. And I make a point here that actually, when we talk about sustainable buildings, there's an old adage that the most sustainable building is one that isn't actually built. So I guess what I'm saying here is question what your motivation is to do works, and whether there are any alternatives before you embark on any construction work or any works. Decide on your direction of travel, what you want to achieve out of the building. Consider a change of approach. and a change of use, do you need certain sections of the building to be open all the time, serviced, lit, etc.? Could you look at a different pattern? And that comes down to building management. I do feel that the holistic building approach, which is advocating a lot of the guides I suggested to you earlier, is the right way to go and can help you with your project team make those decisions. Having done that, I think we then need to look at some of the questions that were posed as part of whether historic buildings can be environmentally sustainable. So I'm stating here that if you've committed to works, and when we look at this question of how do we encourage the use of sustainable materials and methods in construction, for me this is talking about the embodied CO2 of construction materials and embodied energy, but predominantly now it's embodied CO2. And that can involve a life cycle assessment, or what is a carbon footprint analysis of the building or the works. Embodied energy or embodied CO2 is essentially all the energy, cradle to grave, of a product or an element that can be steel, that can be plastic, it can be glass, it can be mineral wool insulation, from its extraction from the ground, from its manufacturing, from its processing and its delivery to site and its installation, and then its ultimate disposal. That is the energy in that process and the CO2 that's embodied. And when you look about sustainable material choices, that's what you need to consider. Now, in helping inform you about different methods of construction, that's where a life cycle assessment can come in, and increasingly we're quite busy in undertaking life cycle assessments. And in fact, a life cycle assessment analysis has been included in the Greater London Authority planning requirements on some major projects, because embodied CO2 is becoming of increasing importance. If you can look at the component level of a building and just make decisions on different materials, then you can make decisions on different methods of construction. And it's a framework that we use is EN 15978, which is a specific framework for how you can take different life cycle assessments at different stages. But in principle, and in all my experience, what it essentially is telling you is that locally sourced materials, sustainable materials like timber, will obviously score highly. And construction methods that involve those materials, say timber frame, if the timber is sourced locally, are going to be beneficial. And I think that's quite important in this sector, because historic buildings are usually utilise materials that are close to hand. Their architecture is vernacular and local. And I think there are some lessons to learn from the past in how we approach building design that are now coming back. And that's seen here under how you choose sustainable materials and approaches for any construction. Think local, think minimising transportation, think minimal extraction and processing. And then that essentially is a sustainable material. We undertake life cycle at different stages here in RIBA stages, which is highlighted here. So, you know, we think within a construction process, you should probably at concept stage start thinking about some of these material choices. And we try to be involved to help inform the design team. So this could form part of a holistic building approach, and I would probably advocate that it does, because I think embodied CO2 is important. The other question was, how do we ensure that we make our buildings as energy and water efficient as they can be? So I think this harks back to, if you have that holistic building approach and you have that baseline position, you can then make some informed decisions on what to do with three key areas, one being fabric, the other being services, and then how you use a building. I think this is going back to, again, we're learning lessons about what historic buildings and buildings of the past can demonstrate about good practice. And the same document, the Heritage Council document here, points out that some buildings historically regarded as hard to treat actually are not quite that, and actually perform quite well and have employed passive measures to achieve good performance. Through high mass, through solid walls, you can find that older buildings actually can achieve good levels of comfort. because they can control heat and they can control heat loss in summer months. So looking at the fabric measures, if you're looking at a building, you could be looking at your walls, and you can consider as part of your package of measures, you could look at insulation to those to improve energy efficiency. So you could do external wall insulation, you could do internal wall insulation. If you have a cavity wall construction, you could look at the insulation of the cavity. Naturally, that can be limited by listed status, planning conditions, or local conservation requirements. And I talk about the other risks about actually you shouldn't just undertake these works. That's the whole point of doing the whole holistic building approach, because some of these works will not suit your building. Simply applying insulation to some solid wall buildings that are quite old can actually have a detrimental impact on the fabric, because you're in a position where there's typically been water movement through the wall. You won't have that. You'll trap the water and there can be degradation of the fabric. You have to consider what's right for your building. You could look at insulating the roof, and obviously if you have a cold roof situation which doesn't have any restrictions to it, you could put insulation in there. It's a relatively low cost item. If you've got a warm roof scenario, then that might be possible as well. But some of these buildings will have, again, certain structures will not allow insulation, and there's a limitation there. But you would have to look on a case-by-case basis what you can do to your building. Windows and doors could be upgraded, but again, if you're listed status and single glazed, there are limitations what you do depending on your grade of listing. You could consider secondary glazing. Floors, where possible, we've seen innovative products where insulation is placed under the floor, and you could look at insulation on top of the floor, but that would be very specific to the circumstances and difficult in probably some of these buildings. And then continuity of insulation at the junction point. So if you were embarking on a fabric insulation approach, you would need to think about the junctions around windows, doors, walls, and floors to ensure that you're going to get continuity in insulation. Without spending any money, just looking at your general maintenance program and having a robust maintenance plan can actually be very, very productive. And that can be to deal with draft sealing, that can be to do with air infiltration, and just general upkeep to avoid major repairs, which will end up being more detrimental and more costly to remediate down the line. And I take a graphic here from June 2018 Historic England document, which I think neatly shows the reaction or interaction between cost, disruption, heritage impact, technical risk, and energy and carbon saving. So looking at the internal wall insulation, we can see that external wall and internal wall insulation have roughly the same benefit in terms of energy saving, energy efficiency, and carbon saving. But external wall insulation, as you'd expect, has a significant amount of more disruption, whereas external wall insulation has less so. Whereas on internal wall insulation, the heritage impact, so the risk to heritage impact is not so great. It's very large on the external wall insulation because it's going to change the aesthetic, the appearance of the building by putting an external wall insulation. And they're costly. Both circumstances are costly. Internal wall insulation, you can imagine the impacts to the building from disruption. Double glazing, you can see here that they model that there was relatively insignificant impact associated with double glazing replacement, and this is borne out in some of the work I did on green museums. And it has a relative high cost, and it can have a potential heritage impact depending on what you have to do, because obviously some windows have to be in keeping with the existing building. But the disruption is low. Draft sealing is broadly effective here across energy and carbon, and is low cost, has minimal impact, minimal technical risk, and minimal disruption. And I think that's going back to the point I said about general maintenance and what that can do to improve energy efficiency. The risks are that one size doesn't fit all, and you don't want to fall foul of maladaptation. You need to consider comfort, you need to consider listed status, planning consents, and agreements with conservation efforts. And when I talk about comfort, I also do quite a lot of work within overheating in buildings, because as the UK has improved the insulation performance of buildings, there can be a negative impact of where properties are over-insulated, not ventilated well, and there is a risk of overheating. And that risk can be the same for historic buildings. So if you were to go and embark on an external wall insulation program, you have to think about the wider impact of comfort in the building if you do that. If you've looked at fabric measures, you now need to look at services. So you have to think about space heating, hot water, ventilation, lighting, cooling, exhibit management, obviously because some of these buildings have exhibits that need to have humidity and temperature control to safeguard them. Controls, metering, you can look at tariffs, renewable technologies, and then water use. Firstly, looking at space heating, what is your existing plant? Is it efficient? If it's not efficient, then maybe you could look to replacing it. And I make the point here that you might want to consider future fuels. And this is such a broad subject, so to cover everything is very difficult, but the grid, the electricity grid for the UK has continued to decarbonise with the use of photovoltaics, wind turbines, and all the measures that we've seen over the past 10 and 15 years. And in 10 years, we've seen a 70% reduction in CO2 emissions from mains electricity. And actually, when you look at the government's carbon strategy that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, they are incentivising and they are encouraging the use of electric as a means of helping to decarbonise our built environment. So you could think, as part of how to make your building more sustainable and as part of a low and zero carbon pathway for your building, you could say, okay, we're going to make a choice to go to electric from gas plant. But as part of that holistic building solution, you have to consider running costs, which is the point that I make there. So it wouldn't be just as simple as fitting, say, a heat pump to your building, because you need to think about the thermal performance of the building, the ventilation of the building hand in hand with that, and that your running costs are going to go from 6, 7p up to 12, 17p. But certainly space heating is where you can get some efficiency savings, significant ones. Hot water, same point. I think you just want to think about whether you've got any future use coming up, whether you're going to be adding a catering element to your building. You'd have to consider that as part of what your future plans are. But it's the same point about space heating. Is it efficient? Is it fit for purpose? What alternatives do I have? What's going to give me the least impact on maintenance for the future and serve what I need for the building? Ventilation, heat recovery in ventilation can help. If you go back to my comments about comfort, obviously that has to be balanced. If you're retaining heat, there is a risk that would need to have some form of summer bypass to ensure that you're not charging the building up with warm air in hot days. But if you embark on a fabric upgrade and you make the building increasingly airtight, reducing air infiltration, you have to consider ventilation in relation to that, because the last thing you want for the negative consequence is a buildup of moisture in the building. So ventilation and heat recovery could be an area where you can get efficiencies. But I think I made the point there that you would have to think about specific exhibit needs, but I'll touch that later on in this table. LED lighting was something that I saw created a relatively low cost benefit back in 2011, and I don't think that's changed. But I guess in relation to lighting now, it's about controls. It's about occupancy controls and daylight sensors and how you can maximize the efficiency of the lighting by ensuring it's not used all the time. So on buildings that we work on, we tend to look to see if we can have occupancy controls and daylight where that's applicable without compromising displays, I state there. Cooling, ideally, is the last resort, given the CO2 emissions associated with it. If it absolutely can't be avoided, then you obviously want to look for the most efficient means for that. But the first port of call in that, as part of any holistic review of a building, would be passive approaches. What opportunities are there to have solar shading internal? What opportunities are there for solar shading outside? Can we put some glare control on the building? Look at passive measures, simple measures to reduce heat gain. I think we looked at, for exhibit management on one of the projects, how you could just service the exhibit in isolation rather than the whole room, to ensure that that reduces costs and you're not servicing the whole space. But I think that's quite common now. And controls, I mean, depending on what controls you've got in some of these buildings, they could be quite old plan, old radiators. The greater level of control you've got in zoning a building and then being able to manage that, the greater efficiency gains you're going to get. And that can be a simple application to some of these buildings. And you might want to consider remote access as increasingly smart tech comes into play. Linked to that partly is submetering. If you want to understand how your building's performing, submetering is important. So we would probably advocate submetering to your space heating, your domestic water, your small power and lighting circuit, and any heavy major consuming plant like catering or lifts or other specific to your building. That would be the key to understanding use going forward, so you can manage your energy consumption. A simple measure for making savings is tariff choice. You know, can you simply look at changing tariff? Can you go to a competitive tariff? And that can be a very quick way of getting reductions in that are linked to energy efficiency savings. The application of renewable technologies is challenging within this, because obviously there are plenty of guys from historic England in terms of use of heat pumps and photovoltaics, but it is a case-by-case basis. Photovoltaics are relatively cheap, they generate electricity, and that certainly would be something that I would be appraising on any building that we were asked to look at. In conjunction, I'd be looking at battery and storage at the same time, albeit they're still emerging in the market, and you would have to consider the cost implications and payback associated with those. But wind, hydro, more site specific, certainly hydro would be, but there are some great examples in case studies where these have been integrated into existing historic buildings to the benefit of them and socially and to visitors. I'll touch on that later on. Water use and water efficiency. You could look at your WCs, look at the toilets, are they do flush? You can look at taps, are they spray taps? Are they screw taps, sensor taps? Do you have any occupancy sensors for the WCs themselves? So if somebody was to enter into the room, you can get an isolation switch when they leave, so it actually turns cold water off, minimizing the risk of leaks. You could look at waste in operation. So that's looking at either staff or occupants of the building, how they're using water and how that can be addressed to try and reduce consumption. And also, if you've got landscape gardens, what you're doing about irrigation. Is the planting irrigation free, reliant upon rainwater only, or do you have any rainwater collection, or do you have any options for rainwater to be used or ponds to be used at your site? I think the risk to fabric, as with fabric, is services need to be right for your building, and you would have to work, I think, with an engineer to look at what works for your building holistically, as a combination of not just space heating, hot water and ventilation. You can do them independently, but obviously they all interact to create what is the environment in your building. So you have to ensure that balance is kept. And I think the point I'm making at the end there is that you can't just think of a bolt-on solution. The point I made at the start is you cannot just think you can fit a heat pump and that will solve all the problems. You have to look at the wider impact of the fabric, ventilation and other services. Final element, which again forms part of the approaches that are set out in the guides I showed at the start, in this sort of staged approach, is looking at use. Behavioural patterns can help significantly in relation to making changes to buildings, and educating behaviour can be very successful as really a first intervention, like I'm stating here, to reduce energy use. So study behaviour, collate the information and educate both staff and visitors positively to try and reduce waste, either water or energy consumption. And that would come out of an energy audit and a survey. I think that is one of the first areas you could look at to try and make some savings. And that links to attitudes. I think people need to feel part of this process. So if you're making behavioural patterns, explain why. If you're doing changes to your building, either fabric or services, engage with your staff, make them understand, make them part of it, get buy-in, get engagement, and that way you're more likely to see the gains that you're expecting out of the building if it's properly used and properly understood. You could look at, as I've said, inefficiencies in use of space in the building, on whether you have areas which are used all the time but actually get low footfall, and decide from a management point of view whether we can treat that differently and switch to another area and utilise that for something else to reduce the servicing costs associated with that space. So I think with any of this study about use, you would look at the overall use of the building and how you could match any inefficiencies with what you want to try and achieve. Moving on to the third question, how can we encourage the selection of appropriate sustainable technologies? As I touched on at the start of the presentation, answering this question I think is actually being done already in the holistic approach in section 3, 4 and 5. I think by doing that holistic building approach, by looking at the fabric, the services and the use, and connecting all those elements, you can then make the right decisions for your building in terms of your sustainable strategy and whether that engages technologies or not. I think that's the key to matching your building with what is the right approach. And the next section will probably help answer some of that as well. So the final question was making the case for reuse on sustainability grounds. So for the first part of this, I set out what is the challenge. And the challenge is, having worked in the construction sector for some time, is that there's a perception that it's possibly easier to demolish and less risk than to refurbish an existing building. And often that decision is taken economically. So you will look at the cost associated with bringing a building in back up to the use requirements of the function that you're looking for as a refurbishment. You will look at the cost associated with demolish and rebuild, and a simple decision will be taken there. And again, from a materials point of view, it's often seen easier to demolish and recycle aggregates than to consider repurposing the building and looking at the materials that are built into it. And as the final point being, summarising that it is generally seen as easy to knock down and start again than to face the risk of refurbishment to budgets, costs, programme, and what is the technical challenges of dealing with an existing building or site. It's not easy. It's not seen as the easy option. So that's the challenge in answering this question. But actually, I think it's an opportunity. As I've already mentioned through the presentation at the start, the reuse of our existing buildings is now seen as integral, in my opinion, and within some of the government documentation, to a zero carbon or a low carbon strategy. So I think there's a massive opportunity for historic buildings and existing buildings in helping achieve that. So it's less simple that we actually just demolish. And there's a strong argument not to just waste the energy and carbon locked in our historic buildings. As I've pointed out, embodied carbon now and energy is increasingly important, and I don't think that should be ignored. And it would be a strong argument for the case for reuse of a building. As I said, the Greater London Authority are now asking for life cycle assessments on planning application on certain projects, major projects. So it's starting to be taken seriously. I think we should be looking at the opportunities that there can be for adaptation of existing historic buildings. That's not always possible given its function, but there was a piece of work done by Nottingham where they looked at the historic marketplace in the centre of the city, and they could see that there was a potential for a further 300 apartments to be integrated into that marketplace. That gave a new lease of life to what is a cherished existing asset, but it also demonstrated that there is a low carbon option for housing in the city centre by reusing the existing structure and all that embodied carbon and energy, as I've stated before, locked into the materials of the building. Historic England stated that energy and carbon performance of many historic buildings can be improved, and they can. And I think I've set that out in the previous slides and how we can address that, and it can be done. Budget is key, but it can be done. Use what you've got, use the benefits of what you've got as a building. I've already mentioned, and this statement states the same from Historic England in this year, is that historic buildings have some important lessons that we should learn again from the past about mass, about the breathing of the fabric, and actually levels of comfort which can be managed just through passive measures, through the nature of their construction, and that shouldn't be ignored. They heat up and cool down slowly. They're less reactive, and that's not always great, but it can be very good for comfort. The final point from Bayes is setting out really demolishing buildings that are structurally sound and crushing all the bricks and materials and aggregates from that is completely unnecessary waste. And they state, well, obviously, where you've got alternatives to that in relation to deconstruction and recovery, they are arguing that it shouldn't be allowed, and it's wasteful, and I completely agree with that. So again, that makes the case again for reuse on sustainability grounds, because you don't want to be wasting materials. So I'm heading towards the end now, but we will have questions at the end. But I'd like to just summarise some of the comments I've been through. So I was posed with the question of, can historic buildings be environmentally sustainable? And I firmly believe that historic buildings can be environmentally sustainable. And in fact, I believe that historic buildings, given they're a significant asset to the building, to the country, and of great social and cultural importance, that I think they can be exemplar. I think they have the opportunity to actually lead the way a little bit in best practice, and the opportunities to reuse these buildings and the embodied energy and CO2 in them cannot be overlooked. So I actually think they actually should be leaders in this movement to address climate change and reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. I've already stated that embodied CO2 is of increasing importance. Therefore, the reuse of these buildings in a positive way becomes critical to any zero carbon strategy, including the 2050 targets set by the government. So I think that's an extreme positive in answering this question. Reminding myself of what I've gone through in this presentation, you do need to understand your building first. And I think you do need to consider the holistic approach in trying to understand what's best for your building, what will suit your fabric, what will suit the context of your building, and what purpose it serves within the wider community. You have to understand that to understand the way forward. With that, you can unlock the potential and make judgments in relation to your resource use, your energy use, and how you want to reduce your environmental impact. And the closing comment is something that I've not really gone through in the presentation because I didn't want to start with this. But the reality is, with the COVID pandemic, the heritage sector is under significant financial pressures. And everything that I've set out in this presentation will incur a cost to deliver, and those costs can be great. So I can't ignore that right now there are financial pressures on the sector. But I think there are some measures in there that are relatively low cost that can be adopted in terms of behavioural changes, maintenance management, and looking at tariffs in the first part. what I would say is that I am hopeful, and there has been indications, and I know that Historic England and the National Trust have stated the same, that there will be support for the sector, in that our existing buildings and our cultural and heritage sector can be part of this green recovery. And that leads me back to some of the comments I've made in the summary, in that I think they represent an opportunity in actually being exemplar. And I think if we encompass all the points made in the presentation and how we can address these buildings and how they can be actually shown to reduce CO2 emissions and take advantage of the fact that they're existing and have CO2 locked in them, I think that's a great opportunity for the future. Thank you. So Beverly, I'm going to hand the presentation back to you now, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, Jason. I feel like I've learned so much. That's been a really good morning.
Okay. Hopefully, I think about an hour, maybe just under. I've just passed you back over.
Thank you very much. Got it. Hopefully you can see my screen now. This is our event Padlet. So attendees have been adding questions to this during your presentation.
Okay, that's fine.
I think there are still one or two being typed in, so I'll go from the bottom. Sarah's added one. What's the most cost-effective way to? Oh, I've lost it. Where's it gone? It's disappeared.
Well, if you scroll
there we
up,
go. I got it. What's the most cost-effective way to improve heat loss through traditional windows? Timber frame double glazing can be very expensive.
I think looking back at what I've said through the presentation and some of the guides, its first part is maintenance. I mean, if you're looking at replacement, then it's you're going to have to first understand what your building can do. If it's listed, you're going to have to look at and speak to a conservation officer about what you can achieve. And I appreciate what Sarah's saying, and that can be costly. But the first port of call would be maintenance. And if you're looking at timber frame double glazing that's expensive, you could look at secondary glazing on the inside. There would be the options. I think the first port of call would be maintenance. The second will be understanding, what you have to do, what the limitations are with your building, whether it's listed, whether there's a conservation requirement. And then I guess finally it would be, yes, the reality is if they have to be replaced, they have to be replaced. And you've got to look at ways of how that can be funded.
Thank you. Gillian's asked, you mentioned daylight light adjustment. Could you explain how this is achieved?
I think what Gillian's probably saying there, I'd hope, is to do with solar shading. So if Gillian is experiencing maybe heat gain or solar gain, excessive gain, they can be just blinds internally. They can be utilizing shutters that might be already in your building. It is really about how you can utilize some simple things to reduce the solar gain in there. The other side of daylight is actually solar gain can help with burns. As much as it can be negative, actually getting heat gain from passive measures like solar gain can help with bills in winter months. So I guess, Gillian, you just need to look at how you can control your daylight, and the cheapest way would be for blinds or shutters if you have them. If you don't have those and it needs to be more intervention required, then you could look at external brise soleil or external shading. But I have seen some presentations where, what presentation can nature provide? What is there locally, or what could you plant to actually assist with some of that? That's not an overnight, but hopefully that's answered your question in relation to daylight adjustment.
Great, thanks, Jason. We've got an anonymous question. Who is my first port of call when assessing my space heating option?
Well, I mean, if you have anyone who deals with your maintenance, depending on your building, you could speak to your maintenance manager or your estates team to give you advice on what currently your space heating is. how old it is, whether it's serviceable, and whether it needs replacement in coming years. And when you say, I think you might actually be referring to about your different options of heating and space heating. So whether you were to use heat pumps or gas, that's probably going to be the mechanical electrical engineer or somebody like myself who works within sustainability to give you the best advice in relation to what would work for your building. So in answer, first things first would be maintenance. Who's your maintenance manager? What is it you're looking for? Is it replacement? Is it serviceable? Is it not serviceable? If it's more broader about actually I want to change the space heating approach, I want to use heat pumps, I want to use electric, they're an M&E engineer or a sustainability professional.
Great. There's a question about water use. What are the advantages of technologies such as low water flush toilets and waterless urinals? Could these make a significant impact on water use?
Yeah, they can do. I mean, in a domestic setting, if you went from a 6-litre flush toilet to a dual flush, that can make about a 10 or 15 to 20% reduction in water consumption, theoretically. So yeah, don't underestimate the impact that a dual flush or low flush toilet can achieve in reducing your water consumption. Equally, the waterless urinals. So I think they can make a significant difference, certainly if you're metered in your water consumption, and if you want to reduce your resource consumption, they're a good thing to look at. I think all the time low flush water is, just think carefully about the dual flush approach, whether you want to go 4.2 litre or 6.4 litre.
That's interesting. If a building is found to be unsound, i.e. needing underpinning, can the case still be made for expensive refurbishment in an energy inefficient building with access problems?
Sorry, just let me see the question again.
Can you see it there? If a building's found to be unsound, i.e. needing underpinning, can the case still be made for expensive refurbishment in an energy inefficient building with access problems?
I think the first thing from a building surveyor cap on there is to decide whether you have a health and safety need, and if the building's found to be structurally unsound, you have an immediate need to deal with the underpinning. I mean, that's the first port of call. I mean, so my answer to that is you'd need to consider your underpinning requirement from a structural and safety point of view first.
Yeah.
Then you would then be given the opportunity to look at the building as a whole, I guess, in relation to what you're saying about any energy efficiency measures. But I think it's kind of a question that's more to do with the health and safety and structural stability of the building.
Yeah. Adrian has asked, you just mentioned vegetation in controlling light. Are there thermal properties, particularly in relation to cooling, that can gain from covering a south-facing wall with the Virginia creeper, Boston ivy, or such like?
When you say thermal properties, I'm wondering whether that's retention or prevention. Possibly. I think actually what I was referring to in vegetation was actually if you're undertaking some significant landscaping proposals or significant works to a scheme and there was going to be some planting going in, I was actually specific to solar shading. So I was thinking whether you could have some trees or bushes planted to help from a passive point of view to reduce solar gain, because obviously leaves pass in winter, which allow you to get the maximized solar gain in winter when you need it, and leaves will be there in the summer to minimize solar gain when you don't want heat gain for comfort levels. That was what I was referring to.
Okay.
I'm very intrigued by that question, but yeah, that's not what I was saying.
Okay, I don't know if Adrian might be able to add a little bit more to that underneath the question at all while we go through. We've got, what are the most sustainable ways to heat a building without burning fossil fuels?
Without burning fossil fuels? That's a really good question. Well, You could look at the tariff. You could look at actually whether that's a renewable energy tariff that solely comes from green technologies, and there are providers out there that state that they can provide you with green tariff energy. So that would avoid, hopefully, the burning of fossil fuels. That would be a first port of call, possibly a very simple port of call. If you don't want to do that, then heating the building via biomass is a possibility, but biomass does come with planning considerations, noise and smell. But obviously it's a sustainable fuel source if it's sourced locally. And I think you need to probably just ponder the point I made about grid decarbonisation. The grid is increasingly becoming less reliant on fossil fuels, or the evidence suggests that it is. We embark still on quite a significant PV installation program and onshore or offshore wind program to help decarbonise the grid. So I think although the government is encouraging us to use electric to help decarbonise the grid, ultimately that is because they know it's reducing its reliance on burning fossil fuels.
Right. Okay. Adrian's commented saying, I was thinking about keeping sunlight off a wall in the summer to maintain a cool environment inside the building. Yeah, no, that I think that's I think that's an effective solution, Adrian. I think you could do that because obviously that's going to mitigate the gain on the wall. I guess the building surveyor in me is probably going to think just ensure you choose your plant carefully and that it isn't to the detriment of the fabric, because obviously putting any creeper or growing plant up the building can have a detrimental impact to the mortar and the wall construction. So you just have to think about the plant carefully. But I think I like the idea that you could mitigate gain by putting that up. This one's the $1 million question, I think. What are the simplest and most effective ways to improve environmental sustainability that anyone can do?
Behavioural change. I think you just need to, if you want something simple, you need to look at how you're using your building or your home and make behavioural changes to reduce waste. And that can be leaving taps running, that can be leaving lights on, that can be getting a smart meter. You know, smart meters are readily available now for you to monitor your energy consumption at home, and they're available for buildings. So a simple and effective way is to look at how you use your building and you behave in it. And I think anyone can do that.
Brilliant, that's great. Sarah's added, how do we get around the challenges of all buildings needing fresh air movement to eliminate damp but stop heat loss?
Sorry, where am I looking now?
It's just down here at the bottom. Just turning it purple. Can you see it there?
Well, I think that would be effective ventilation. And, you know, first port of call would be looking at a natural ventilation strategy and how you can ensure you're getting air movement around there. Secondly would be, as a passive measure, but then you could look at mechanical ventilation as a final port of call, but that's going to use energy consumption. I think you want to try and avoid any detrimental impact of applying fabric measures to a building, because if you don't address ventilation at the same time, you could end up with a very airtight building, a very thermally efficient building, but you wouldn't be getting sufficient air moving around there to minimise the risk of moisture buildup. So I think ventilation is the key to that, but I'm conscious that you would try and do passive measures first, encourage cross ventilation.
Okay, that's great. Another one that Sarah's pulled across. I've seen lots of examples of retrofitted cavity wall insulation causing problems, e.g. damp, in traditional buildings. Is this always a bad idea? If so, why is it promoted so much?
Yes, I think there is a risk with applying insulation to these buildings because the dew point and condensation, i.e. the point at which it can build up in the fabric, can be affected by applying insulation to these buildings. And as I said in the presentation, there is a risk where you were to either externally insulate or apply any insulation to a building that could cause the dew point to shift, or it could cause consequences of moisture or damp buildup on an inside face. So there are risks. I mean, what we do to do with that, we would do a condensation risk analysis on the buildup. And there is another train of thought which actually looks at what are the, if you were to insulate one part of the fabric, what is the impact to a part of the fabric that you might not insulate? So there is an interaction between the two. You have to consider what the detriment might be, because the cold will always find a pathway through. And if you close off one avenue, it'll look for the other avenue. So this is why the holistic approach is considered. So we would calculate before, and any good practitioner should calculate the condensation risk and wider environmental impact of applying thermal insulation to your property or your building.
Brilliant, thank you. And it looks like this is the last question. Is there any movement to encourage local authority conservation planners to be more adaptable to heritage building development using sustainable improvements? It's one thing trying to make a historic building thermally efficient versus satisfying the demands of conservation planning consents. It's the one in white.
Yeah, I'd like to hope so. I actually considered that through this presentation when I was putting it together. I'm not sure. I mean, all you can see is the guidance that I've looked at myself in relation to Historic England. So there's plenty out there for conservation officers and planning officers to refer to give them advice which would help them to accept and perhaps relax in relation to some of the measures to ensure that these buildings are kept in use, kept in a fit for purpose condition, and can be environmentally sustainable. But I haven't seen anything specific in relation to that. On the guides that are available from yourselves and Historic England and National Trust. But I agree with you, that is a challenge, and I'd like to think, as climate change continues to go up the agenda, that they should be more amenable to some of these adaptations and changes that these buildings want to apply.
Oh, we've got a couple more just appearing. I don't know if you can see them. They seem to appear slowly. Give them a second to come up.
There was a response actually in relation to the most sustainable form of space heating, I think, from one of the anonymous, which said insulation ! Which yeah, very. I accept that. I think it's a very good point, and perhaps I was being too specific about a response to your question.
Oh, there's also there. Will listed building status change to be more adaptable to helping listed buildings be more energy efficient? I think.
I don't know if anyone submitted any papers or supporting documentation to suggest that, but I think the reality is if these buildings are going to be part of a green recovery and be adaptable and be flexible and stay in use for the benefit of us all, I think there has to be some consideration to that.
Yeah. They've appeared now. There are signs that the pandemic will affect building layout, e.g. hygiene measures and water use. How will this impact environmental sustainability?
It's a good question. I mean, I think air quality is increasing importance in relation to ventilation of buildings, which is something that Sarah touched on. So I think I would probably say the air quality will be looked at more closely post the pandemic. And my concern there is that to manage ventilation in the building, if not done correctly, can have detrimental impacts, but can also actually increase energy consumption and cost, which is not what we want to achieve. It's a challenge really, because if we are going to have to look at greater hygiene controls and measures, the reality is they will need to be serviced. So I think the only way you can respond to that is that you would have to look at them in the most efficient way you can do. But we will all have to make adaptations and to deal with any changes that we have in relation to the pandemic, I'm afraid.
That's great. Last question. Is underfloor insulation an efficient means of preventing heat loss beneath a suspended timber floor? Are there any problems that might arise? That's from Adrian.
I'm working on an innovative project at the moment where insulation is actually being taken in by a robot, I believe, and sprayed to the underside of the floor. So there are some innovative measures out there, and I have looked at this in the past. My concern was how you minimise detrimental impacts to the timbers, assuming, as I say, it's a timber floor, timber joists. And to do that, you need to maintain the cross ventilation. So I think one of the solutions we used in the past was a beaded insulation, which still allowed ventilation through. And I've also done heat loss calculations for a floor where there's still been a void to allow that cross ventilation. And actually, the thermal performance still improved, albeit you were left with a little void below the floor to enable air movement to mitigate the risk of condensation and rot, I guess, associated with the floor. So there are solutions out there, is the answer.
That's brilliant. I suppose it's just left to say that if anybody has got any more questions, they can either add them onto Padlet after the webinar, or they can email them to me or to the main HTN email address, and I'll pass them on to Jason, and we'll get them answered for you. But I suppose it's just left for me to say thank you so much to Focus Consultants for being such great supporters of the network. And thank you to Jason for putting this amazing presentation together. I'm sure we've all learned a lot this morning. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, Beverly. It's a huge subject matter that I'm happy to take any questions. There isn't always one answer, so I'd welcome people if they want to chat to me. It's fine. Brilliant.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. So I'll end the webinar now, but please do check out our events page for more webinars that are coming up and our conference. And also look out for an email in about an hour that includes the feedback form. I'd really appreciate it if you could fill it in. It just takes a minute or two. So bye from us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beverly.
Bye.